All right, so let's take a look at how I mixed the drums in this song. I have one section of the song looped multiple times just for the purposes of making this video, so you might hear some weird cuts. But let's take a look at what I did. Before we even listen to anything, let's just take a look at the editing side. So this is pretty common practice to cut out everything except for where the toms hit. With tom tracks, you end up with like a lot of tom mics. In this case, we actually had top and bottom mics for multiple toms. And a lot of stuff bleeds into tom mics, and then you have all those multiple tracks and it really adds up. Also, the way that you mix toms, a lot of times you have to do some pretty drastic things to really get the toms to sound good in the rest of the drum mix. So all the drastic things that you do to mix the tom tracks, everything that's all going to happen to everything bleeding into the tracks. So it's pretty common practice to just cut all that out and leave only the parts where you have tom hits in. You'll see I also did that with the snare, and that's because I ended up doing some pretty drastic things with the snare tracks as well. If you listen to what the snare sounds like dry compared to the final mix, it's pretty different. And so all that drastic stuff was also happening to everything bleeding into the snare tracks. Also, the kick was setting off the gate. I've got some gates on the snare tracks, and so you were hearing that stuff on the kick, and that didn't sound good. So it did take a little bit of time, but I manually went through and deleted everything that didn't have snare hits in and just left the little bits around where you actually hit the snare for the actual mix. So that took some time, but it was definitely worth it. All right, so let's take a listen here. This is fully mixed. And this is with everything off. So obviously things are still kind of balanced here. I've got the levels changed, but no plugins. All right, so here's the kick in. We've got a gate, just so that some of the bleed is cut out. And I really didn't do anything with the EQ. I probably played around a little bit, but settled on basically doing nothing. Here's the kick out. A little bit of gate. And then I cut the highs quite a bit. You put these two together, you get some nice click from the inside kick mic and some nice body from the outside. I did leave the body, the lows in the inside mic as well. A lot of times you actually cut all that out and you just use it for the high end click. But I ended up keeping it in. Now on the bus, so both of these are routed to one bus track. And on this bus, I've got quite a bit going on. So here's a channel strip. Driving it really hard, so I have 18 dB added on the input, and then I took 18 dB out of the output, so there's no level change between these two, but it's emulating what would happen if you drove a channel strip like this, an analog channel strip, hard. So you can see that's why it's clipping. That's on purpose. So we're just boosting the highs a little bit, boosting this boxy mid-range around 500, which is kind of weird because I end up cutting it out later, you'll see. And so that's kind of a weird thing that you do, but sometimes you want to boost something at one stage in the game and then like maybe you're compressing that and then you end up wanting to pull that out later, but it was helpful here. Also boosting the lows a little bit. Here I'm pulling it right back out. Actually, this is around 342, so it's not the same area as the 470, but pulling out some of that boxy mid-range here, also taking some of the lows out because in this song the kick didn't need to be like super boomy and like subby. It's more of like a mid-range boxy punchy kick. Wolf compressor, doing Wolf compressor things. And then another channel strip at the end, which what am I doing here? Nothing on the EQ side, just a little bit more compression. And pulling out a little bit more lows, pulling out a lot of the highs actually. All right, moving on to the snare. There was actually 3 snare tracks sent. I ended up just going with, this one was called snare crack. It sounds like an under snare, so like the snare sizzle. A little bit of gate. Increasing the high end sizzle. That's pretty much it on the EQ side. Basically no compression happening. This one was called snare ping. Now, these snare tracks had a lot of this like ringy tone in it, so I'm using soothe to take that out. You're gonna hear a weird sound when I turn this on, but it'll even itself out in a second. So this is helping to cut out a lot of that tone, that ping happening. Also trying to do that here. So I'm boosting the low fundamental frequency of the snare so that it has more punch later. And then here's that frequency area that's like ringing a lot, so I'm trying to cut some of that out. And then here's the whole snare bus, so both of those tracks together. I ended up not using the one that was called snare body. So soothe again. Here's where it pulls out a lot of that ringing frequency. So you can hear it's a pretty dry sounding snare now. A little bit of compression. Adding to like a more cracky sound, like adding more transient attack to it. Got gate, cleaning it up a little bit. Another gate, a little bit of compression happening, actually quite a bit of compression happening. And here we're boosting the highs a lot, cutting the mids, boosting the lows. So off, on. Yeah, so that's doing a lot of the work there. A little bit more compression to make it punch more. And then a little bit more snare sizzle and a little bit pulled out here to make it probably sit better with the acoustic. Toms, there's not much to say. Probably did some EQ, but not much to do with tom tracks. And here's the overhead. I actually should have started here, but here's the overhead sound. Now, this is a personal preference, but I'm a drummer, and when I sit down at the drums, the ride cymbal is on the right and the hi-hats are on the left. And so when I mix drums, I like to mix them so that it sounds like when I'm sitting at the drum set. So I used this direction mixer and did like 180 degrees here, so basically flipped the tracks around, put the left on the right and the right on the left, basically. And then I also decreased the spread a lot. So it sounds like this. So that's not changing the mix at all, it's just basically changing the stereo imaging. But this is a lot closer to what it sounds like when I sit down at the drum set with the ride on the right. Here's the full width. Here's fully mono. This song didn't really need super wide drums, so I went with kind of a more narrow mix, so that like 0.28 or something. And then here's what I did with the EQ. It looks like a lot, but honestly it's not a whole lot. This is just pulling the lows and mids out of the side, not the whole track, just the sides. Which is again narrowing the stereo imaging a little bit, because we don't want to hear the lows and the boxiness like in the stereo imaging. It makes it like clouded sounding. So by narrowing this, we just keep the lows in the center. In your mix overall, we want to keep the lows kind of centered. So this helps to do that with the drums. Without narrowing it so much, it's just pulling the lows and mids into the center and out of the sides. Alright, so here's all the drum tracks together. And then we add some compression on the whole drum bus. It's not a whole lot, but it's enough to kind of glue it together a little bit. It makes it so that when the kick and the snare come in, it will like duck the cymbals a little bit. Not like a noticeable audible amount, but enough where it makes it sound like all of the drum tracks together are kind of reacting together. Like the cymbal track, the overhead track, is coming in and out a little bit, like it's being compressed a little bit, along with everything else, but only when the kick and the snare tell it to do so. Both compressors obviously doing a lot of work here, pulling everything together and making it really punchy. And then honestly not too much for this last EQ, just pulling out a little bit more low end, just to tuck the drums into the mix a little bit better.